Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on behalf of Campaign for Better Transport, CPRE, Greenpeace, RSPB, WWF and Green Alliance to the Greener Britain husting. Greener Britain is the thing that unifies all of us as organisations, the idea that Britain can only be better, more stable and a happier place if it is greener, and indeed that a greyer Britain will not deliver any of those things. We've spent the last 6 months promoting some of the ideas of how to achieve a greener Britain in this document with the political parties. And tonight is our big moment, our big chance to hear how they've responded and what their priorities will be and how, importantly, how they'll achieve some of those objectives. I want you to help us make this a big green moment by tweeting furiously using the Greener Britain hashtag with your phones on sound off, please, and to listen very carefully to what you hear, because one or more of the people on this panel, this fantastic panel that we have, is going to end up leading our response to the environment in the next government, we can assume. Let's not pretend that environment has been high on the political agenda in this Parliament, but we have now come out of recession and we expect the next government to reinvigorate the environmental policy and delivery agenda. So I'm delighted with the panel that we have tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce our Inquisitor General, someone who will be known to you from BBC Countryfile and Radio Forecasting the Earth, Tom Heap. Tom, would you like to come and take charge? One final thing, we have a drinks reception, as is the Green Alliance tradition, after the event. Some of the panellists I know can stay, not all, but you're very, very welcome to stay and dissect the evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And first of all, welcome to the audience. Great to see it bursting at the seams, this hall. And of course, welcome to our panel. And you could not get a higher calibre of podium to talk about these issues. Right Honourable Liz Truss MP, Right Honourable Davey, Caroline Lucas MP, and of course the Right Honourable Caroline Flint. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for putting aside the time to come and debate these critical issues. It's not just the audience in the room, we also have an audience outside on Twitter. This whole debate is being live streamed, and so if you have any questions, all of you out there in the digital universe, not in this room, please do send them in, and we will try and get to a handful of them for sure. The audience for these subjects is very wide. There is no doubt about that. All the opinion polls suggest that people expect the next government to really safeguard the environment. I mean, 2.5 million people care enough to give their money to support groups, many of whom are supporting this evening's event. And as we know, and I'm sure they're tired of being told, that's 5 times as many as are members of political parties, but always worth remembering that one, I think. So the environment is obviously crucial to the next 5 and obviously hundreds of years beyond that. And if, like me, you're slightly fed up and occasionally shout at the radio over the kind of binary debates over things like health and economy and immigration and very little else getting a word in edgeways, then this evening really is your time. Other issues are available, as we in this all room well know, and this really is your chance to hear about them and perhaps, most importantly, hear what this group of people who will have considerable responsibility and power over what happens in the next 5 years, what their plans are to deliver on what you would like to see. Now, we are going to do one of these things where we're going to ask a question at the beginning of the audience and again at the end to see, in effect, how your views or how your feelings about what you've heard have convinced you or not. So the question that we are going to put, and you have these polling buttons on your seat, I believe. You can press numbers. Should be, I said not binary, this really is binary. You can press 1 for yes and 2 for no. Okay. If we're all vaguely settled and we've found our clicker machines, I'll give a little bit of more hubbub time. Okay, so are you optimistic that the next government will make progress on the environment? 1 for yes and 2 for no. What? Which government it will be? Yes, indeed. Hopefully they have faith in you all, so we'll see. Okay, has everybody done their requisite button pressing? Very good. Well, this evening's subjects are broadly broken down into 4 areas: international leadership, the national world, stronger communities, and the resilient economy, and how green issues fit within those 4 broad subjects. But we've just got an even broader opening question to begin with, and I'd like to ask Michelle Thomas to stand up and ask her question. Ask it bold and loud. It's a reasonably sized room.
Okay, I would like to know what you believe is the most critical environmental issue that you will need to focus on if you do get into power.
And once more now, you've been given the mic, please.
What do you believe is the most critical environmental issue that you will need to focus on if you get into power?
Thank you very much. Caroline Flint.
Well, I think a standing priority, despite the passing of the Climate Change Act in 2008, is to continue to make progress in that area. And I think in the last 5 years, I think in many respects we've gone off track on that for a number of reasons, partly because of the lack of joined-up government between the 2 parties on either side of me. So I think that is critical. I was very pleased, well, not pleased, maybe that's the wrong word, but at the time of the floods that we experienced in this country, I was reassured, I think that's the right word, reassured that Ed Miliband made the point that, you know, what we were witnessing in our own country was a national security issue. And therefore, it's vitally important that we can influence in Paris in December by showing leadership at home. So I think that's massively important. On a more local level, if you like, as a constituency MP, I think we have a huge inequality in terms of access to the benefits of a green environment for many communities in our country. I think something like there's 5 million fewer visits to woodlands and forests in the last 5 years than there were before. And I know from my own area in Doncaster, you know, what we're seeing, and I'm sure in other cities and towns, is a degradation of green spaces through lack of money and joined-up working. So I think there is this massive global imperative, but I think at the same time, in terms of making these issues as relevant as we can to people's everyday life, we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of green spaces and the enjoyment of it for the many and not the few.
Caroline Lucas, if you have influence over the next government, what is going to be the top of your agenda?
Well, I think with Paris coming up this year in December, I would agree with Caroline Flint that the climate crisis probably is the overwhelming priority. And what worries me is that we quite often have the 3 other parties on the same page when it comes to some nice words about dealing with climate change, but a complete lack of joined-up thinking when it comes to looking through at other departmental responsibilities. And so it's only a few short weeks since the party leaders signed the Green Alliance coordinated letter on climate change. That was very important, everybody agreeing that it's a national priority, a key urgent priority. And yet we had the budget, of course, a few short weeks later, and in the budget we saw yet again the government giving yet more tax breaks to fossil fuel exploitation, more and more subsidies for North Sea oil extraction of gas and oil from the North Sea. So it's completely unjoined up. We've also got a government clearly that's hell-bent on setting up a whole new fracking industry. So we need a lot of work on this. And so I think part of the way I would answer the question, as well as having much tougher targets when it comes to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and again, it's a real shame that the 3 main parties are not supporting 2030 EU targets on energy efficiency and renewables. But as well as those targets, I think we need a new architecture for environment and energy across government, because it's clear that just leaving it with DEFRA or DEC doesn't work. We've got to have some kind of Office of Environmental Responsibility or some kind of ombudsperson. There's all sorts of different ways of organising that architecture, but organise it we must. And then perhaps on a more local level, picking up on the point about people's concerns on their doorstep right now, I do think that people are deeply concerned about the fact that 60% of species have been declining in the last 50 years, and that we do need that Nature and Wellbeing Act as another form of architecture on which we can then add more targets, more local ecological networks, giving more flexibility to local authorities so that they can put in place protection areas for those areas that people care most about in their localities.
Thank you very much indeed. Liz Truss, what would you be putting top of the list if you're still in that post after the election?
So one of the difficulties, I think, in the question you ask is trying to unpick the environment, because the fact is it's an interdependent system and we need to achieve all of it. And whilst I completely agree about the importance of the Paris summit and how the leadership of the Green Alliance has shown and all parties have signed up to it being very positive, we also need to look at issues like air pollution across the globe, water quality and biodiversity. And I'd like to see focus on those issues as well at a global level. And I think what's also important is looking at the whole landscape, both on land and on sea, and making sure that we do protect our marine environment, where there are serious issues at the moment. Under this government, we put in place 27 marine conservation zones. We've got a further 23 in the pipeline. We also, in the budget, announced the Pitcairn Islands is going to have a marine protection zone, which is vitally important for protecting the coral, the algae and the fishes in the vital important part of the world. So I think there is a lot we can do to show international leadership, not just on climate change and carbon reduction, which is very important, and carbon emissions have reduced by 6% under this government, but also on issues like air quality and on biodiversity. Furthermore, I think there's more we can do to link people in this country with the natural environment. My job before I became Environment Secretary was as Schools Minister, making sure that on our national curriculum, children are learning about food, how food is produced, but also about the natural environment from an early age, so they can go out and enjoy places like I've seen the Wildlife Trust offering fantastic education. And I think it's so important to link people up from an early age, because I feel as a country, a lot of us have become disconnected from the natural environment or from the landscape. And that's not just important for our own, the future of the environment. It's actually important for our health and our well-being and mental health as well. And I think it's got a very important role to play. And that's one of the things I'd like to focus on in a new parliament.
Davey, I'll come to you just in a moment, but I'd just like to pick up Caroline Lucas's point. I mean, Pitcairn is a small green space in a blue ocean. Was it the only green announcement in a generally sort of blue budget that didn't have anything else? And was the budget incompatible with your leader's commitment, the pledge made with the help of the Green Alliance on committing to Paris and really saying that climate change is the most serious threat? It didn't seem to be present in the budget.
Well, we're already pursuing those policies. We've got the incentives, and I know Ed will probably talk about that, the incentives through DEC. But also in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, we've launched a new countryside stewardship scheme, which is £3 billion over the next 6 years.
But
specifically,
just on the question I asked you, because Caroline mentioned it, was on the budget. I just want you right to reply to her. She said the budget wasn't very
first
climate
of all,
friendly.
we did announce the Pitcairn Islands, which I think is
on the climate issue.
really important. And my point is that those measures are in place in DEC already to put in place the right incentives to get the energy mix we need to
Bottom line
hit
on climate
those
change.
targets.
So, Ed
I mean,
Davey,
Can I first of all answer the question on the budget?
Yes, please do.
Because I was delighted to see the announcement that we are going to open negotiations, formal negotiations, on Britain's first ever tidal lagoon power station, the world's first ever tidal lagoon power station. I'm delighted and proud that we've got that through.
One of the seven estuary.
But in terms of Michelle's question, she asked what's the top priority. It is climate change, because the science is absolutely clear. We've got to run at this. It's really pressing and urgent. And tackling climate change tackles so many environmental issues, whether it's our species, the oceans. All aspects of the environment are being affected by climate change, so it's got to be urgent. And with Paris in December, we have to run at this. The Liberal Democrats on the front page of our manifesto, one of our 5 key pledges, will be on 5 green bills. And the first green bill will be for zero carbon Britain. We believe the science is now showing that the Climate Change Act of 2008 wasn't ambitious enough. We need to raise our targets in the UK for a zero carbon Britain by 2050. That's a very ambitious position, and we want to legislate that in the first Parliament. But I'm conscious that the UK is only responsible for 1.5% of global emissions. We are not going to get a deal in Paris. We are not going to get a deal internationally. We're not going to tackle climate change unless the next government does what I've tried to do, which is work internationally to push this agenda far more quickly. So in Europe, because we negotiated the climate change negotiations in Europe, I set up something called the Green Growth Group in February 2013. That was critical for landing the EU 2030 climate package in October last year. And many colleagues across Europe believe that if we hadn't got together in the group that I set up, we wouldn't have had that ambitious deal, which is now leading the world in terms of commitments for the Paris Climate Change Treaty. But Europe alone can't do it. We've got to work with the Americans, with the Chinese, with the Indians. So actually, climate change diplomacy is probably the most significant thing in the next year and beyond in order to really enable us as a world to tackle climate change. And without that climate change diplomacy, without Britain showing a leadership, we won't get there.
OK, we have another question on climate change, so we'll be able to come back to these things now. In fact, I'd like to ask Steve McDonald, if he's in the room. Steve McDonald, yes, if you could just hang on for the microphone, sir, and then we'll come to your question.
Thank you very much. How will you guarantee that the UK's target of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 will be met?
Thank you. And I should just say the precedent on the first question that everybody gets to answer every question will not necessarily be followed on all the following questions. So please don't feel hard done by if you don't get to answer every one. But I would like to put that to Liz Truss on this one. How will you guarantee that the UK's target of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is met, will be met?
Well, first of all, we're absolutely committed to this target. It is vitally important that we do address climate change and we show global leadership on it. I think the difference in approach of our party and maybe some of the other parties represented on this stage is that we want to give producers, consumers, the freedom to innovate in different ways that we can see carbon reduced over time. And that's why we prefer a more general target, putting a price on carbon essentially, so that we can see the innovation take place. Because there are technologies, for example, like carbon capture and storage, which we've invested £1 billion in over the course of this Parliament. We may see results from. I want to see us enable that innovation. But what I can say to you is we will make sure the incentives are in place and we will follow the impact they're having and make sure that that is taking place. We've already delivered on the first carbon budget. We're on track to deliver on the next 2, and we will continue putting those incentives in place and monitoring them to make sure that's delivered.
Why don't you have a 2030 target?
Well, we do have a 2030 target for reduction at the EU level by 40%.
But you don't have a British decarbonisation percentage target.
But we would want to hit that EU target. But my view is
so just to be explicit, what is your target for Britain by 2030 then?
Well, my understanding is that there's an EU target which we would seek to hit of 40% reduction.
OK. Yeah, Caroline Flint.
My understanding is that we are off track globally by, I think the emissions gap is 17 gigatons. So we've got a 17 gigatons emissions gap between what we need to achieve, in terms of what we need to achieve by 2030. So, clearly Paris is very important to that. I am very disappointed that the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats didn't support setting a decarb target when they had the chance in the energy legislation. Now, Ed may say they've got it in there, but the truth of what they did bundle together is the fact that if Labour wins the election, we are prevented by law setting a decarb target until 2016. because that's what these two made sure was in that piece of legislation. We lost the vote in Parliament by 23, and I believe actually setting a decarb target, we should have done that earlier in the Parliament. It would help to get us on track. We have to be mindful about the fact that the carbon emissions have gone down. Some experts say that's more to do with the downturn in the economy. So we have to be very careful about, as there is an upturn in the economy, we don't see that going in the wrong direction again. So the decarb target that Labour set out, and Ed Miliband was the first party leader to support, the power to give the Green Investment Bank borrowing powers so that they can do more. And the other week I talked about green bonds as well for individuals and communities to invest in the cleaner energy we need going forward. And, I think there have been some really important missed opportunities in the last 5 years, and we're very clear about our policies in this area to put it right. I should also say is that, we support the structure around the carbon budgets, and we might have done well with the first one, but again, I think we have to look very closely at the other carbon budgets, because if we're not careful, we're in danger of going off track on those as well. And that's why some of these instruments that only governments can sign up to are so important to get the investment in, but set the direction of travel.
I'd like David to come back on that point that you said about 2016 amendment. But just one thing to you, Caroline Flint. How compatible is your price freeze promise with getting more renewable energy, given that, like it or not, at the moment, renewable energy costs more than the average market price?
Well, I don't think the price freeze has anything to do with that. I'm not just saying that.
Well, a lot of renewable energy organisations were very worried when you came out with that announcement.
Deters investment.
What renewable energy organisations say to me, and those who want to invest, is that they want clarity about the certainty of the direction of travel. That is why the decarb target was so important for renewable organisations and companies like Siemens, because it gave that sense of where we needed to get to. That is vitally important. But let me just say this. I do not think that there is a contradiction by playing fair with the British bill payers who have been ripped off by these big energy companies, the big six, and having a cleaner energy generation future. I don't think there should be a contradiction.
Aren't you hoodwinking them, pretending it's cheap?
No, it's about what is fair in terms of prices. 3/4 of bill payers are being overcharged at this time. And if we want to unite an alliance of people in terms of where we need to get to and convince them of the jobs and opportunities with that, I think we have to assure them that in the energy market, one of the jobs of government is to make sure there's a framework in which we can make the big decisions for energy change and security, but also make sure bill payers are protected. And I don't see any contradiction in that.
Thank you. Ed Davey.
Tomorrow I'm publishing reports on low carbon energy investment since 2010. It'll show over £40 billion invested, and that's been attracted from around the world. If we had an energy price freeze, that would not have come. You tackle energy bills, which are a real problem for people, through energy efficiency, through competition. That is what we have done. That's what we would do more of if the Liberal Democrats are in the next government. But you asked about, can we meet the 80% climate change target? Liberal Democrats want to go more. In our Zero Carbon Britain bill, we'd actually increase the 2050 target to zero carbon. And how will we do that? Well, in that bill, we would have a power sector decarbonisation target. I legislated it for in the 2013 Energy Act. We'd be able to go forward in 2016 when we set the fifth carbon budget, exactly the right time to do it. We've already given Caroline the certainty and stability to investors through, first of all, ensuring that the fourth carbon budget was not revised, as the Chancellor wanted to. I fought him off on that. The fourth carbon budget was not revised. Moreover, we got the 2030 package in Europe, which is actually far more powerful for investors than a UK-only power sector decarbonisation target, because it sets the framework for investment in renewables across the whole of Europe, which is a bigger market, by the way, than the UK. So we do that. We'd have a power sector decarbonisation target in that Zero Carbon Britain bill. We'd give the Green Investment Bank more powers, just like Caroline said, but actually we're going to go further than Labour on that. And we would also legislate to end unabated use of coal in power generation by 2025. So we've got some really chunky measures to start off with. But you've really got to run at this if you're going to achieve it. A lot of that will be through R&D and innovation. We need to be spending more on R&D and innovation in a whole series of low-carbon technologies, particularly in heating and transport. This Parliament has really dealt with the power side through the electricity market reform, so we're really greening the power side of the carbon emissions, but we need to do a lot more on transport and heating, and that's going to need a lot of investment in innovation, R&D to bring on those technologies. So those would be our overall view.
Just
How
very
do you
quickly, Karen.
explain that in 2014 the investment in renewables is only at the rate it was in 29 and it fell in 2010, 2011,
You're just completely
2012
wrong.
and 2013?
You're just
Oh, it's
completely
Bloomberg
wrong.
Energy Finance Group that say that.
Caroline,
not me.
Okay, hang on,
I'll
Caroline.
tell you what, I will let everyone
Very
here
quickly, Davey,
read
please.
the low-carbon investment report we're publishing tomorrow. It sets out all the details and shows that the figures that Caroline and Labour have been using this are completely false.
Okay, we've got a question, a bit of a stone in the shoe, often of, I'll come to you in a moment, of climate change policy. A question on airports from James Lees. James Lees, are you in the room? If you could just wait for the microphone, sir. Hello. Starting to...
Strange bottle sound already.
How will any future UK airports and aviation policy be compatible with the party's environmental ambitions?
Thank you very much. Caroline Lucas, what would you do about our airports?
Well, I'll tell you, and hopefully I can also answer the
I'm
previous
sure you'll
question,
squeeze it
which
in.
was about climate change, which, frustratingly, I wasn't allowed to answer.
I'm sorry.
The question is very well made because, frankly, I think it is simply incompatible to think that we can meet our climate change objectives and go on expanding aviation indefinitely in this country, which appears to be the policy of the other parties. We would say that there's absolutely no more space for the expansion of aviation because when you add in not just its CO2 impacts, but the impacts, for example, of water vapour at altitude, then aviation accounts for around 9% of our emissions so far. Sadly, we haven't come up with a way of replacing aviation fuel with anything better yet. And so until we do, then I think we have to be very clear that it's not a question of whether we should be expanding Heathrow or Gatwick. It's a question of saying we are not going to be expanding either of them.
Would you like us to fly less?
When you say like, I mean, I
Well,
understand
would
and
the Green
appreciate
Party
why flying is
like to see us flying
it's a
less?
wonderful thing to do, but I think we need to fly less. Yes, I think we do.
So,
I think that, you know, when you see people who are regularly flying, I mean, I'm not saying that
How many
everyone
times
has
have you
their
flown
one
in the last year?
holiday, for example. Sorry?
How many times have you flown in the last 5
I haven't
years?
flown
not
in the
at all.
last... I mean,
Not at all.
But what I'm trying to say here is I'm not against the individuals who will go on one family holiday, but if you look at some of these so-called budget airports, actually they are being used by people with above average incomes who are flying very regularly to second homes and everything else. We need to change the price signals because, you know, when I said I didn't fly, that wasn't to be smug. It was because I can afford to go by rail to Italy or France, and that can cost more than it does to fly. That is ridiculous. It should be the possibility for everybody to choose the more environmentally sound way of travelling, not for some sort of, you know, someone to kind of claim brownie points because they were able to travel that way. It is absolutely ridiculous that the Eurostar is costing us 3 times more than flying. But if I can come back to some of those other points, because there was a bit of an argument going on there about renewable energy. And what I wanted to say was, in a sense, obviously we need as much renewable energy as fast as we can, but the bottom line is what we need to do is to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Because if you're still extracting your fossil fuels at the same rate, it doesn't really matter how many more renewables you've created as well. The bottom line is those fossil fuels are being burnt and they're causing more and more climate change. So I think we need to be listening to those experts who are telling us that we need to leave between 2/3 and 80% of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And if you start there, then I think you start looking at a whole range of different things rather differently. So you'll be perhaps querying why this government has put into statute a requirement to maximise the economic recovery of fossil fuels. That is absolutely perverse and irresponsible. What they should be doing is putting into law, you know, the maximising of greener energy sources.
So if you want to keep fossil fuels in the ground, then nuclear has to be the option, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. And there are plenty, again, of reports, for example, from the Zero Carbon Britain report from McCuntliffe, showing you how, if you add up, because we haven't really talked much about roads and aviation and heating as well as electricity, if you start to add all of those in, it is perfectly possible to meet climate targets, the required climate targets, without nuclear and without fossil fuels. It means having
how
a
much would it
different
cost
kind
the
of
bill
economic
payer?
model.
And how much would that cost the bill payer? Your model.
Over time, if you look at the DEC calculator, if over time it doesn't cost you any more
What
than
about
what
the
we're
next
doing
5
now.
years? It's going to be more
I haven't got the
expensive,
figures on the next 5 years now.
But it's going to be pricey.
It's going to be pricey, but if you compare it to the fact that right now we're not internalising the true costs of the environmental damage that we're doing, if you added in right now the cost of the climate damage that we're doing, which people don't do, then you would find that it's actually not more costly. But of course, at the moment, we're not internalising those costs.
Thank you. Ed Davey.
Well,
on the airports particularly.
Yeah, we don't want to see any expansion in the airports in the southeast. But you've got to find ways to enable people to travel. So the huge expansion we're seeing in the railways, we've got the biggest expansion since the Victorians in the railway infrastructure, is critical to enable that, particularly to reduce the need to fly over relatively short distances. I think we also need to invest heavily with the aviation industry in new technologies, because we do need to find a way to green aviation over the next few decades. We've really got to do that. There has been some progress, but we need to go further and faster. Another key thing for the next election next government is going to be a conference in 2016 of the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's looking at creating a global carbon market for aviation. We were trying to do that in the EU. We got bullied out of it but primarily by China and India and the United States. But in negotiating that, we said that there would be a global agreement for a carbon market on aviation emissions in 2016. If we can make that happen in 2016, it will be the biggest step forward for reducing global aviation emissions than we have seen hitherto. So both within the UK, that approach of restricting growth of airports but massively investing in rail, but internationally working with others to get a carbon market to reduce global aviation emissions, that has to be the way forward.
So just a quick yes or no answer. Are the Liberal Democrats happy to see unlimited growth in air passengers so long as they fly from the north?
No.
So what's not unlimited, but you're happy to see it go up? How much? 10%? 20%?
Well, we haven't given a percentage on that.
Well, give us one then.
Well, I like to think for the next 5 years, I've set out a pretty comprehensive approach that we want to massively invest in railways to reduce the need for people to fly short haul. That has to be a practical approach which you can deliver in the short term.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Paul Hatchwell, please, who has a question related to the EU. Paul Hatchwell? Yes, sir. Just hang on for the microphone. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. What implications would there be for UK environmental policy and clean tech investment in the event it were to exit from the EU?
I wonder who I'm going to put this question to. Liz Truss.
Thank you. Well, first of all, what we want to see is a reformed EU, and that's what we are fighting for and negotiating for. And I think if you look at some of the successes we've achieved recently, say, for example, the common fisheries policy reform, where we've seen powers given to a more local level, we've seen a discard ban put in place, so healthy fish are no longer being thrown back into the sea. It shows it can be done, that we can take decisions more locally, and I think that's applicable on aspects of environmental policy as it is on aspects of fisheries policy and agriculture policy. So I would like to see more local decision making, but to continue within a European framework, because if you look at the red tape challenge the government did recently, 25% of all of the rules and regulations in the red tape challenge were DEFRA rules and regulations. And I think in some cases we can achieve better outcomes by doing things in a different way, in a more efficient way. As we have seen with the common fisheries policy, I'd like to see that more broadly over environmental policy. I did want the opportunity to answer the aviation question as well, if you don't mind. I know other people have tried to sneak in other questions, which is, this is my point about, we have to reduce carbon in the most practical and cost-effective way and look at the areas where it's easier to do that and we can get most bang for our buck. At the same time, of course, we need to research cleaner aviation in the longer term. But I think saying that we should take fewer flights or that we shouldn't deal with our airport capacity issues can be potentially damaging in the long term because we lose our economic growth from exports. We're already
We might
exporting.
lose our planet. What we're talking about here is an ecology, and we could lose, seriously, many, many millions of people's livelihoods if we go on with climate change.
What we're talking about,
to change it.
Caroline, is the best means of doing this. And what I'm saying is have an overall carbon target and do it in the most efficient way possible rather than picking out
If you carry on with aviation as it is now, you would have to reduce the emissions from practically every other industrial source of emissions massively.
And I know
so
that
if you don't want any other industry, that's fine, but you're not going to have it with aviation
I know that we
as well.
could. Of course, we should be incentivising technological development, but to say that we should just stop people flying, I don't think is a realistic proposition. And I think the way that we bring the general public with us in getting the environmental changes we need to see is be realistic about how we do that in the short and medium term. That's why education's important. That's why technology and research is important. And I think just saying we're not going to have anybody flying
I don't think I
is
said
not
that.
a
I said let's not
realistic
expand
proposition.
aviation.
Liz,
Well, you
Liz,
said you wanted to see fewer people flying.
Thank you.
Could I just make one more point, which
I'd
is
like you to answer the
vital...
gentleman's question, really, which is about clean tech investment and leaving the EU. You can make a very small point if you come on to that one afterwards. Yeah, what was the other thing you wanted to say?
The other point was on broadband, which is I do think the...
Excuse me, that's fairly left field. Could you answer the...
it's about people being able to work from home more and use less transport by investment in new technology.
OK,
is the point I'm making.
we'll have video conferencing. That's lovely. But the gentleman said, what would be the impact on clean tech investment in the event of exit from the EU? Could you answer that one, please?
Well, as I say, we don't want to exit the EU. What we want is a reformed
But do you accept
EU.
it would be a threat to that if you did leave the EU?
Well, what I would say is we do need to see clean tech investment just as we need to see good environmental protection in this country.
Caroline Flint.
I think there'd be enormous impact on clean tech investment. I think there'd be enormous impact on investment across the board. And I cannot think of anything worse than having a situation after the election on May the 7th of 2 years of internal wrangling over us having an exit strategy for the EU. Look, I'm not saying that we're going to ever make everybody in Britain love the EU as an institution, but there's a lot of homegrown institutions that people don't love either. But I think, and they're not all political either, but I think it would just absolutely be a disaster. And the first question today was, one of the first questions this evening was about, investment. I can't think of anything worse. And let me just add to that as well, security. I mean, our energy security is part of this as well. It's part of us having a strong national voice, but as the European Union going as a bloc together to have a strong voice in those international discussions as well. So I think it would be a recipe for disaster to waste precious time if the Conservatives are re-elected to discuss coming out of Europe. We've got to... Nobody disagrees with reform, but reform for a reason, not playing to UKIP and everything they stand for.
Davey, if you give me a brief one on this, please.
It would be disaster for environmental policy and for investment in clean tech, absolutely. And I want to paint a nightmare scenario. There's a Conservative majority or minority government. That's a pretty disaster. But for the environment in Europe, because just as we are preparing for the Paris negotiations on climate change, the most important climate negotiations ever, with Britain up to now leading the way in Europe and really pushing the European agenda, the UK minister at the EU Council, let's remember we negotiate at the UN as an EU, would not be listened to because they would currently then, at that stage, be negotiating, changing our views of membership, putting through the House of Commons a bill for a referendum. Do you think that's going to impress the rest of our European colleagues? Do you think our voice will be heard in those circumstances? It's a total disaster, a recipe for Britain's voice on climate change being completely muted and ignored. And given that Europe has actually played such an important role, I love telling my Conservative colleagues that EU product standards have had the biggest impact on energy efficiency in this country. It's my favourite line to Conservative colleagues. And I also like pointing out that the 2030 EU climate package that I negotiated Before we negotiated, only 5 EU member states had a post-2020 legal commitment to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions after 2020. But by negotiating with Europe, we were able to push the whole standards up in Europe, lead in Europe, so now 28 member states have a 2030 legally binding target on them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That's what Britain can do in Europe, and that's how Europe can help the climate change and the environment agenda.
Thank you, Davey. Yeah, briefly. Caroline Flint.
I
Sorry, Caroline
agree
Lucas,
that
my
leaving
apologies.
the EU would be a disaster for environmental policy and many other areas too. Having said that, though, I do think when we're talking about reform, some of that reform can be in the role that the EU plays on the environment, because although here in Britain the EU has played a pretty positive role in terms of bringing up our standards, it has not been quite so benign if you're in one of the Nordic countries, because so often standards are regarded as a ceiling rather than a floor. In other words, if you want to go further than some other EU standards, for example, if you wanted to have every bottle being a properly returnable bottle or whatever, EU standards can actually stop you doing that because the single market kicks in. So I do think that, yes, we absolutely want to stay in the EU, but that debate about reform has to be a very serious one, because there are some big threats coming to us from the EU right now too. I'm thinking of things like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I'm thinking about that kind of ruthless international trading, which quite often undermines livelihoods in poorer countries. So I think we need to look at the way in which the EU conducts itself and have it with sustainability as its aim, rather than global competition as its aim.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, a question about fish from James Shipley, please. James Shipley, they're all hiding by the pillars over here. Yep, gentleman in the grey sweater up there. Thank you.
If elected, how would your party work to tackle the problem of overfishing in the seas across the globe?
And can I just ask you, sir, how big a problem do you think overfishing is, and the problem with the lack of fish is?
Very big.
Okay, very big. I caught it and it was that big. Liz Truss, what would you do about the fish in the sea?
So first of all, I think we've made massive progress this Parliament with reform of the Common Fisheries Policy. It was led by Richard Bennion. He did a fantastic job. First of all, in achieving the discard ban, which was put in place this January, which means we're no longer throwing healthy fish back into the sea, and also giving more powers for member states over specific quotas in their areas of the water. But I think there is still more we need to do on various fish types, and it's certainly a priority for us. We put in place marine conservation zones.
But not very many of them. In fact, not nearly as many as were
We put in
desired.
place 27, and we've just launched 23, consultation on 23 more. We obviously need to do it on the best available evidence. And one of the things I'm keen to do is see those zones linked in a blue corridor, in a marine corridor, so we can actually link those areas in the way that we have done landscape scale natural protection on land. I'd like to see seascape scale protection as well. The Pitcairn Islands, I think, is a major step forward. But as has been pointed out about international leadership, there's a lot more we can do internationally. I think that is working with counterparts like the Chinese. I met the Chinese Minister of Environmental Protection recently to talk about what they can do on water quality and preserving marine areas too. So I think we've achieved a lot in this Parliament. And certainly, I would say we've made much better progress on the Common Fisheries Policy than we have on the Common Agricultural Policy, where I'd like to see more reform, but there is certainly more to do.
You mentioned Pitcairn. Can I just ask, I mean, we've got an awful lot of these UK overseas territories,
Yes.
and they're all, most of them rather, are small islands amongst big oceans. Isn't there potentially a really big win there in terms of being brave and creating some enforceable marine parks? Wouldn't that be, a sort of a thing that's within our power? These relics of empire has left us with that potential.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge potential there. I completely agree with you. We have to make sure that we are able to do what we've said we do. We're able to offer the protection. I would love to see us do more in future, but I think Pitcairn is a very good step forward in terms of providing that vital protection.
Caroline Lucas, do you think these islands give us an opportunity to really flex our muscle internationally on fish?
Absolutely, I do. And I'm a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, and we did a report on this very subject. and some of my colleagues went there and discussed with
You didn't get a boat there yourself. It was
I didn't go
difficult
there
to fly.
myself. Discussed with the governments, and I think they came back actually pretty shocked at some of the state of the environment, both marine and on land, come to that. And I think that, for as long as we do have this somewhat colonial relationship, which we can perhaps question in another debate, but for as long as it's there, then I think we should be using it for much more to be a power for good than we are at the moment. I don't think we are using as much leverage there as we could. I wanted to come back to those marine protection areas, though, because you said we have 27 with a consultation on another 20 or so. But I mean, the original figures, I think, were around 130 or something. So I mean, this is dramatically reduced, and I don't understand why we couldn't have gone ahead with the number that was originally proposed. And I think we certainly should have done. I think we need a network of protected areas across the Atlantic. I think we need to be looking at a reserve in the South Atlantic. I think we need to have protected areas in the Arctic. I think as well, though, we also need to look at the common fisheries policy, and my party is pretty critical of it, and unless it changes quite a lot, I think that might be an area of EU policy where we might think that it would be better under national sovereignty, because at the minute we don't think the CFP has been working. That the Commission will come forward with quite ambitious proposals, and then the member states just get into this incredible haggling and bargaining, and the actual reserves that are created are far, far less ambitious than the Commission originally proposed. So I think there's at least a question mark there about how rigorous they are.
Thank you. Briefly, Liz, just
Well,
want to
what
come
we
back on
have
that very
seen is more local control over territorial waters, which enables more of those agreements to be reached. So I think we have seen positive progress in terms of subsidiarity and getting more local decision making. I agree with you that we should go further.
I have to confess an interest that the last Audit Commission report that you mentioned got me a ticket to the Turks and Caicos Islands in order to do some investigating.
We won't ask how you got
please,
there.
Please bring on some more of those kind of reports. Right. Sheila Wren has a question about wild spaces. Yes, Sheila.
No.
And the mic is coming down the end left. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is, what will your party do to protect and enhance the UK's last wild land and encourage the reinstatement of lost native species?
Caroline Flint.
Well, I'm very proud, actually, that the Labour Party, under many different governments, has been at the forefront of trying to protect land that we all hold dear, but also, I have to say, make it much more equitable in terms of people enjoying it, whether it's from the first national park that we had in, I think, 1947, the South Downs, I think it was in 2009. So that's been part of our, if you like, legacy going forward, and there should be more of that. We were just talking about the marine situation around our shores as well. I think it was something like, I think it was actually, Caroline, 127 recommended sites. We've only got 27. There's an opportunity, I understand, coming up in 2015 and 2016 to designate more. And I think what's crucial about that is, I think Liz was saying this, is how we make them, the ecology of it, connected and coherent in a way that makes sense. And I think that's very important.
The question was about wild land. What's your ambition for that?
But I think in terms of, those wild parts of our country is making sure that we actually create an environment where they can continue to be as wild as they possibly can. I think that's absolutely important.
But what are you going to do to make that happen? That's what I'm interested to know.
But I think part of it is doing our own audits and our own examination of these spaces both around our shores but on our shores as well, and to think coherently how we will protect them. And I think that is about working with different organisations to find the right ways in which we can, given the size of our island and people that live here, make sure we have strategies to protect those species that are most at risk. I think that's how you work to do this. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I think it's about interrogation of those wild spaces and looking at how other impacts could have an effect. And if we don't have some sort of national strategy that, if you like, adds as some informative break before development goes ahead, I think that's a difficulty. So that's my view on it. It's about having an assessment of these wild spaces, what's in them, what's important, how we protect it, and make sure that's not just something at national level, but at local level feeds through.
Do you think we should have wind turbines in wild spaces?
Well, I mean, I support onshore wind, and I think it's important, but I think on every development that takes place, to be honest, whether it's an onshore wind farm or, for that matter, a refinery or housing or anything else, it should go through a due process, and we should be making sure that our colleagues in local government have guidance that helps them in making these decisions. And I think that's very important.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take a question from Twitter here, actually, from a Maggie Rowlands. What policies does your party have to protect the heritage and archaeological environment alongside the landscape history? So it's sort of the people's impact on our past environment. What would you do to preserve that, Ed Davey?
I'll be honest, I'm not absolutely sure.
That's the kind of honesty we like. How important do you think it is to protect it?
Well, it's very important to protect it.
You haven't quite got the tool with you.
Yeah, but I don't have the tool with it. I'll tell you what I was going to say. And I'll try and link it back to that. I talked earlier about the 5 green laws that we're going to have on the front page of our manifesto. Key part. Talked about zero carbon Britain. We want a zero waste, a green transport, a green buildings act. But we also want a nature act. And in that Nature Act, we want to have statutory targets on biodiversity, on clean air, on clean water, and access to green space. And we really want to enshrine those in law, a bit almost like nature's version of the Climate Change Act, if you like. I'm not sure if we would link that to heritage and archaeological assets. I'm not sure if it would come into that act. We would need to look at what are the problems. I have been concerned about various things that Mr. Pickles has done with the planning system, and some of the financial constraints on local government, because in the past, when you are building a new development, there was a chance for local archaeologists to go and look at the site as the builder uncovered the foundations. But that needed both protection in the planning system, and it also needed resources in the local communities for people to actually be paid to go and look at what was the archaeology that was being uncovered as builders built their foundations. So I would want to make sure, and I'm making up Liberal Democrat policy as I go along, but who cares? That we...
The journalists are typing away in the front row, it's good.
Well, it's fine. That we ensure that there was the planning law and the resources to enable that very important bit of archaeology to happen as the land is uncovered before people actually build over it.
Thank you. Liz Truss, heritage and
you find the previous kings of England, by the way.
Heritage and landscape history are very important to Conservative voters. What are you doing to protect it?
Absolutely, and we do have a lot of organisations like English Heritage who specifically look at.
And how's their budget going to fare?
Well, it's still part of the process that they do need to look at those sites, and
so how is their budget going to fare? Sorry.
I'm not the Chancellor. I'm not going to be able to commit to budgets on it. But what I would say is it's important that we look at entire landscapes, many of which have been shaped over centuries and shaped over generations. In my own constituency, we've got some Neolithic flint mines that are part of the natural environment. And I think we do need to link up heritage more with what we look at on the natural environment. So we don't just look at what it is now, but how it was shaped over generations. And it's certainly something I'm very willing to look at for the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a little bit of Chairman's prerogative and put a question in myself here. Is NIMBYism a force for good or ill? Caroline Lucas.
I think it's important and valuable to protect what you love. And I think sometimes the term NIMBY is not used very fairly. What I think is not good is when you're just trying to get it out of your backyard and you don't much care where it goes after that. What I think has been so impressive, for example, around the campaign against fracking, is the way in which people are not saying, don't frack here, go and frack somewhere else. They're actually saying, we don't want fracking and we will go to wherever fracking is happening and we will join up together, collaboratively.
Really? Did the people from Surrey go up to Lancashire
Absolutely.
and
The people in
protest as much
Bolton,
there?
with whom I spent quite a lot of time, were from all over the place, were other places, indeed people coming down from the north of the country where they had had some fracking there already. It's the same with some of the campaigns about aviation expansion. Again, a really good model where people from Heathrow have been in solidarity with people in Gatwick and other places to say we want no further growth in aviation. And so I think, if by NIMBYism we're simply saying go and put it somewhere else, I think that's negative. If it's saying we protect what we love and we'll also support others to protect what they love, then I think it could be a very positive force for good.
Ed Davey, is NIMBYism force for good or ill?
Well, it reflects a democratic process. So as someone who believes in democratic process, you do have to give a voice to people having a say in their community. The question is, how do you do that and still ensure that we get the green energy that we need, the housing that we need, and all the things that enable our society to be more prosperous and look after the more vulnerable in society, particularly those without decent housing. One of the ways is to have a really clear plan. Liberal Democrats are arguing for 10 garden cities. They will be in some parts of the English countryside. But Clegg has been leading. He led a commission, led a competition to look at those places. We've already identified the Oxford and Cambridge corridor by having the rail link restored between Oxford and Cambridge, and we believe, working with local communities, we could find an area there for one of our garden cities. So you have to have sort of a leadership approach that shows that there is something in it for the local people, but you do have to go through a democratic process, of course.
But does the democratic process give the local people a veto?
It doesn't at the moment, and I don't think it should do. It never, in my own constituency, we get the council turning down a planning application, it going to the planning inspectorate, and the planning inspectorate overturning it. That happens now, and I don't think any party is proposing to change that overall framework, but it follows a proper process of law. And I think that is the way that you get the balance between allowing people to express their view, which sometimes is called NIMBYism, but making sure that view doesn't create a veto. Another way forward is actually to create IMBYism, trying to create incentives for people to actually want to have things in their area. And the way you do that is by showing that there is something in it for them.
Liz Truss, hasn't Eric Pickles in effect given the NIMBYs a veto with his attitude over wind turbines, onshore wind turbines?
Well, I do think it's very important that we carry local communities with us, and we do look at the impact on landscape, the impact on other areas when we seek to do things like expand the energy mix. I think there's already a lot of onshore wind in the pipeline. We're seeing other forms of renewable energy being very effective and very low cost. So I think it's right that we give local people a say on what's in their local area. I think that's true about the built environment as well. I mean, we've got to consider, and carbon reduction is very, very important, but we need to do it in a way that is most cost effective, protects our landscapes that we all treasure.
Sorry, just got to pick you up on the cost effective one. I mean, you've ruled out just about the cheapest one, which is onshore wind.
Well, I think if you look at other technologies like solar, is very cost effective as well.
You don't like it in fields either. You don't like in-field solar. You've on record of saying you don't like it. It's one of the cheapest.
I haven't said that at all. There are 350,000 acres of commercial roof space where solar panels can be placed. And I think this is about making sure that we have the right technology in the right location, and we allow local people to have a say in shaping their own local environment. If we look at history, if we look at the brutalist architecture of the 60s and 70s that went up, in spite of the way people lived and the way people lived their lives, it was a massive disaster that broke up communities. And I think it's wrong for central government to go around and imposing particular types of structures or built environments on local communities that don't support them. I think we all want to see low carbon technologies. We all want to see a mix of energy supply. There are the right places, in my view, to have solar energy and wind energy created. I also support nuclear. I support a mix of energies. But we do need to give local people the say over those technologies.
But not when it comes to fracking under their homes.
I was going to come on to that in a second.
Well, no, fracking is part of the local...
Just hang on a minute.
Can I just, sorry...
we're going to come on to fracking in a minute.
Fracking,
I received
Liz, we'll come to fracking in a minute.
From 100 MPs, almost all Conservative, a few Labour, telling me to stop onshore wind. I ignored them. And I've had to fight day in, day out, particularly with Mr Pickles, to make sure that onshore wind investment wasn't completely curtailed. We have been successful. We would have been even more successful if it wasn't from some of the opposition from our coalition partners.
Sorry, I just want to avoid this fracking...
No, we're just about to have a question on fracking, so please
answer. It is part of the local
answer.
planning system,
Thank
Caroline.
you. Just...
it is part of the local planning
Liz.
system.
Thank you. Can I have a question on fracking, please, from Helen Taylor? Helen Taylor, yes, if we could bring a microphone down to you. Just here, please. Thank you very much.
Hi, my question is, What is each party's position on fracking? And do you oppose or support this, and why?
Now, I'm going to be generous and let everybody answer this, but in return, I'd like you to be relatively brief in your answers, please. Caroline Flint.
Just one very brief point on the NIMBYism, because I got away with not being asked that. I think, look, people are entitled to their view. What worries me is when a group of people, because maybe they are more confident, they can get up and speak in things, end up suggesting they speak for the whole community. And when I was housing minister, my biggest concerns was those voices against affordable housing in some of our rural areas, because actually some of the families that had lived in these rural areas for generations and weren't just incomers, were basically being crowded out by those who just didn't want that in their community. I don't think that's democratic, and I don't think that is acceptable. So moving on to the fracking, situation. Well, look, I've been very, it's boring, I know, but I've been pretty clear for 4 years about this. We're not setting our face against the potential use of shale gas. 80% of our central heating supply is from gas. We're going to need gas for some years to come. So if there is a way of realising this, in line with the amendments that we put forward recently in the infrastructure bill, then we think there's an opportunity to look at it. I feel concerned that for the last 4 years, instead of having a reasonable debate about this, we've had polarisation on it caused by mainly the Tories, but I have to say you're in government with them, with Ed, who've basically ramped up shale gas as the panacea for all our energy needs. And in doing so, we've had a polarised debate that hasn't focused on, I think, one of the main jobs of government, and that is to inspire confidence that the framework for any development is done in a way that is safe and environmentally protected. And I think that has been a lost opportunity for 4 years, and I'm very disappointed that the coalition government didn't accept Labour's amendments.
Thank you. Ed Davey, you're being accused of your sort of over-enthusiasm for fracking leads to a sort of undermining of the faith that it's going to be properly regulated.
Well, there's 3 positions you can take on fracking. You can be completely against it, or you can be what I call the frack baby frack people, mostly in the Conservative Party and some in UKIP, who would like to frack every croquet lawn in sight. Or you can take, I think, rather the more scientific-based approach, which is pretty cautious, which is the approach I've taken as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. We are at the very early days of this industry. It's got to prove its case. It has got to meet some of actually the world's most robust and strict regulatory system, which we have put in place. If you look at the amount of money that's been spent in fracking and the exploration, because we're very much at the exploration stage, not at the production stage, it's tiny compared to the other energy investments we've seen, particularly in low carbon. So it could well be needed and may well be successful. And you know, I think it would be good if it was for 2 reasons. First of all, climate change. We are going to need a lot of gas over the next few years for heating. 70% of our gas is used to heat our homes. We haven't yet developed all the heating technologies to displace that. 30% in electricity. Our North Sea gas is falling. We're importing a lot more. And our marginal supply of gas today, and likely to increase, is on ships from Qatar. LNG, liquefied natural gas, energy used to put it in the ships, to gasify it, to make it liquid, to bring it round, and then to regasify it. The carbon footprint of our marginal supply of gas today is bigger and more dangerous for our climate than the carbon footprint of shale gas properly regulated in the UK. So you can actually make a climate environmental gain by displacing the marginal supply of gas we have at the moment and will have for the next 2 or 3 decades with shale gas. That's an environmental argument not often heard, but it needs to be heard.
Thank you. Caroline Lucas, please.
Well, it won't be displacing that. It will be displacing renewables. That's the fear that by the time we get shale gas coming...
It's not at all.
Well, by the time we get shale gas, as you've said yourself, it'll be another 10 years. And by that time, if we were properly investing in renewables, that is what should be coming on stream in big numbers.
We are properly investing in renewables.
If we need,
massively.
I accept we need a time of further gas, but what we could be doing is investing properly in biogas, for example. That would be a lot less polluting. Well, not properly at all. I was interested to hear what Caroline said about Labour Party's position, because at the time of the infrastructure bill, there were lots of Labour MPs saying, we do support a moratorium. How dare you say we don't support a moratorium? Our 10 points equal a moratorium. And now it's really helpful to know that you don't support a moratorium.
That's not true, actually, Caroline. We've made it very clear. Unless we have our regulations on the statute book, fracking will not be allowed to go ahead.
Which regulation? Which regulation? In detail, we have put the world's leading, toughest regulatory regime.
Thank you.
Well, there are two key points.
Give me one example.
Well, two key points that were in Labour's multiple level of regulations that they wanted. One was about groundwater protection zones, and the other was about fracking not being allowed under natural parks. The government ignored both of those, and therefore it ought to be the case that you would be saying that you want a moratorium. And as I understand it, that you're not. What we should be doing, I mean, you're talking about a scientific approach. I think the scientific approach is recognising that if we need to be leaving 2/3 to 80% of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground, if we're to have any hope of avoiding 2 degrees warming, the idea of setting up a whole new industry and falling over ourselves with subsidies to set up this industry, which won't actually come on stream for another 10 years, is just about one of the most perverse things you could possibly be doing. We cannot be serious about climate change. As John Ashton says, who was a former climate envoy for the previous government, we cannot be serious about climate change and our commitments under climate change and go ahead with a big fracking industry. The choice is there, and I think the Greens are very clear about it.
Wouldn't it be better for the environment to use fracked gas to kill coal rather than strangle fracking at birth?
But by the time fracking is coming on stream, that coal should be off the grid anyway. You just heard Ed Davey himself saying that Liberal Democrat policy was to get coal off by 2025.
For the UK, coal, we may want to get rid of coal. It keeps on growing, or it doesn't go down much in our electricity mix.
But under the EU policy, under the the combustion policy of the EU, coal should be coming off the grid at exactly the time that shale is coming on anyway. So it will not. That's come back to my point. It will not be displacing coal.
We'll believe it when we see it. Liz Truss, what is your party's position on fracking?
So first of all, my department is responsible for the environmental protections around fracking. We've done a lot of work on this. The Environment Agency have done a lot of work on this. There is very clear evidence from the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, that provided we have the right protections in place, it does have a minimal impact on the environment and it is safe. And I think, in terms of the impact on the environment, we've already got onshore oil and gas in this country, for example, in Witch Farm, an area of outstanding natural beauty, with the support of local residents. So I think what we need to do is work with local residents, which is what the Environment Agency is doing, to help people understand the specific protections that are in place. And just like other forms of energy we've discussed, this does have to go through the local planning system as well. There are also protections in place by DEC too on seismology. So it really is very heavily protected and regulated. And I think that's the right approach.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a question I'd just like to ask. Someone asked me on the way in. Given the fact that so many parts of government spending, are being redlined and protected, health, education, possibly defence, what is going to happen to DEFRA's funding in the next government? I'll start with Liz, if the Conservatives get into power.
So over the course of this Parliament, DEFRA has seen a reduction in the budget.
How bad? I want to know about the future. How bad is it going to be in the future?
I want to tell you the approach of this Parliament and what we'd adopt in the next Parliament. But nevertheless, despite that, we've managed to protect frontline services. So we've got the same number of vets working for DEFRA, which is vital in terms of protection against animal disease. We've also managed to put a real terms increase in terms of flood defence spending over the course of this Parliament. We've just laid out our 6-year programme for flood protection, which, including the impact of climate change, will reduce flood risk by 5%. Again, it's a real terms increase. And I think we can do that by using data better as a department, by enabling our organisations to work together. For example...
So these really are all backward-looking. We could have got this from the cuttings. I want to know what's going to happen if you get elected in the next 5 years.
Well, we will move in the same direction. We will continue to make efficiencies within the organisation, and we will protect frontline services.
So continued efficiencies means greater cuts, yeah?
Well, we will make our organisations work. So, for example, where we've got offices in the same location, co-locating our operation. Those are the types of things.
Thank you. Caroline Flint, what would happen to DEFRA under Labour?
Well, across Whitehall, apart from the protective areas, we've identified there will have to be departmental cuts year on year. And, you know, just be upfront with you about that. But where I think we need to...
So just to be upfront, DEFRA will be cut under Labour?
There will have to be departmental savings year on year. Yes, there will. And that's part of our plan to bring the deficit, bear down on the deficit, and get us within the Parliament into a surplus situation. Now, part of what I think we need to look at is just how we get... I mean, it's interesting, you know, there's Ed and I from Energy and Climate Change, and Liz from DEFRA and Caroline speaking across different areas. There's lots of different departments that have an in to the work that we're all concerned about. And I absolutely do believe that there is room for much more joined up working. We were talking earlier about, for example, about access and about green spaces. I think there's more we could do in terms of devolving to local government some of these responsibilities and powers. I think there's a hell of a lot more we could do in terms of health being an active partner in some of this work too. So I think there is a lot we can do across government to use the money we've got in a smarter way and end some of the silo arrangements that exist across Whitehall. DCLG and DEC is just one example we've had this evening.
A question about housing from Mindy Hardy, or Haddy. Mindy Hardy? Yes, down here. And we're getting near toward the end of the time, so if you could keep your responses very brief, that'd be great. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, madam.
Hi, it's Mindy Haddy, actually. Given that the UK has one of the most inefficient housing stocks in the EU, what more will each party commit to do in order to improve energy performance and lift people out of fuel poverty?
Just before you give the mic back, what do you think of the performance over the last 5 years on insulation and fuel poverty?
Well, it's had some good intentions and good policies that have actually now, over the last year or so, been reduced in the
Just
move
good, bad,
to
or indifferent will do.
regulations.
Okay. Ed Davey, are you going to improve what has been a bit of an embarrassment when it comes to insulation and things over this?
Well, I don't think doing 1 million homes in the last 2 years through Eco and the Green Deal has been an embarrassment. That's been one of the fastest rates ever. We want to speed up on that. If you look at today...
What will you do to speed up on it in the next Parliament?
I'm just going to answer your first question, this final bit. Today in Parliament, minimum energy efficiency standards have gone through a statutory instrument committee to make it illegal for a private landlord to let out a property from the 1st of April 2018 if that property is not meeting minimum energy efficiency standards. I'm really proud of that as a Liberal Democrat. I had to fight a number of other colleagues in the coalition to get that through, and it's now gone through today. That's going to mean 1 million tenants benefiting from warmer homes, tackling fuel poverty. But in terms of what we want to do in the next Parliament, one of our 5 green bills is the Green Buildings Act. And that's going to want to bring in even tougher regulations, not just in the private renter sector, but across the board. It also wants to do 2 other things that are going to be critical for promoting energy efficiency right to the top of the agenda. The first is to bring renewable heat and energy efficiency together. If you're talking about the carbon and energy performance of a building, you need to bring those 2 together. They've not been together, and we need to bring that together. We also need to have both renewable heat and energy efficiency considered to be infrastructure projects. So they sit alongside decisions about new power stations or roads or whatever. They need to be a much higher status to bring a lot more capital expenditure through into energy efficiency and renewable heat. That Green Buildings Act, I think, will be revolutionary in the way it brings all aspects of greening a building together.
And Liz Truss, if you're in power after the next election, are you going to really deliver on insulation and not dismiss it as green crap, which seemed to be what happened last year?
We are absolutely committed to delivering on insulation in the next Parliament.
How will you do it?
I have to say, I haven't got the details of that. We haven't launched our manifesto yet, but I'm sure we will be announcing those in due course.
Very briefly, Caroline Flint, if you can, just on insulation, I'd like to keep it brief.
Well, first of all, we're going to completely revamp the ecosystem as soon as we can when it ends in 2017. We're going to take the same amount of money we have at the moment that comes from the energy companies, and instead of a top-down approach, we're going to actually have it delivered from the communities bottom up. We think that that model for local area schemes with local authorities and other involved is the best way to deliver, but also to create jobs, but also deal with some of the anomalies in the system where a family in, for example, many streets in Doncaster, Victorian terraces, someone's an owner-occupier or in the private rented sector and they can't get advantage of the eco scheme. We're also going to set a bigger standard for the private rented sector to reach C by 2027. And I have to say, and I said this when I was shadowing the communities and local government brief, given 40% of housing benefit goes into the private rented sector, I think we should expect more for those people living in those properties, and we can't just expect the tenants to ask for it because it's not fair on them when they're up against the landlord. And finally, the Green Deal. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked because the interest rates haven't been attractive enough, so we will have a switch spend and other measures to provide 1 million interest-free loans for those who can afford to pay something over the course of next Parliament. And it will be a national infrastructure priority, energy efficiency.
Thank you very much. Charles Clover, you have a question?
As it's the newest policy of the government, and as it was allegedly the biggest conservation measure by any government, according to Zach Goldsmith and Nick Hurd, I'd just like to know what the parties would do about this pit can announcement if they were the next government. Would they do the policy that the government has announced, or would they do more than the policy, or would they not do it at all?
Primarily for Caroline Flint.
Well, I'm not quite clear, actually, to be honest, from the budget statement, just exactly what is the extent of the government policy. I think it is good that we're looking at another major area in the world that can have this protection. But I think we've got to do some serious discussion about what that means in terms of delivery on the ground and what the resources are into that. I was reading, actually, before I came here about some of the technology, satellite technology, that's being developed in Oxford. I understand something called the Catapult Project, which is quite interesting because that allows you to map these areas and keep an eye on what's going on whilst then deploying resources in a meaningful way. I think that combination of using technology and resources on the ground, it will provide a more sustainable way of managing some of this, rather than just thinking we can just send everyone out there to guard it or protect it in a way that isn't led by what we need to know and the science and technologies available. So that's so that, well, I just said to you at the beginning, it's not clear what the government's offer is on this. We support the extension to this area, but we've got to make sure that we actually follow that through with something that means something, and that's something Maria and my colleagues will be looking at.
Thank you. Fiona Harley.
Yes.
Okay, I'll amplify that a bit. Have you written to your pension funds to ask them to divest from fossil fuels? Caroline Lucas.
Well, I have got a campaign in Parliament trying to get the Parliamentary Pension Fund to divest, and they won't even tell us where they are investing. And by the law of averages, they will have some investments in fossil fuels, undoubtedly. But the fight that we're having to get them to take that seriously and lead by example, you know, this would be a wonderful story that if the Parliamentary Pension Scheme would divest, how wonderful would that be? Alongside the churches and other leaders of society, it would be amazing, but they haven't done it yet. But let me just have 10 seconds, because I cannot sit here and hear what Ed Davey has said about this government's record on energy efficiency. I'm the co-president of the all-party group on energy efficiency and fuel poverty. And under this government, there has been an 80% drop in insulation measures provided for the fuel poor. We've seen the end of CERT, the end of CESP, the end of Warmfront. The Green Deal has been a disaster. Eco actually pushes more people into poverty because of the way it's funded by putting a levy. It's your own DEX figures show that by putting a levy on all people's bills, including the fuel poor, you push more people into poverty than you're able to pull out with the money you're getting from the eco. So you need to...
Affordable warmth. That's just simply not true.
It's for your own figures, and what you should be doing...
people who've got boilers and insulation under affordable warmth, that's scandalous.
What is scandalous is 80% drop in insulation measures under your government, Ed Davey. That is what is scandalous.
I'll take the people in your constituency who benefited. They've been your benefit. It's astonishing. I can't believe you admit that. There must be... I'll get you the figures for your own constituency efficiency for all the people who've benefited from the affordable warmth scheme and the carbon savings.
It's
not true.
Thank you very much. Under your
Outrageous.
government, there's been much, much worse.
The numbers have fallen. You let
Simply not true.
You let the big six off the hook.
Simply not true.
Thank you. Caroline Flint, you want to speak? Would you answer the,
No,
would you answer the question
no,
about whether
I
you should...
haven't. I will look at it in detail after tonight.
Do you think they should divest from the fossil fuels, Caroline Flint?
Well, I think, as I say, I'm going to look at that. I think it's interesting in terms of where... Well, I'm trying to be honest with you. I haven't written to them, and I will look at that to see how much they do invest in that area, because, that's something to look at. I think the way pension funds are going, and certainly the ones that have been in contact with me, from the Teachers' Pension Fund in Canada or whatever, they are interested in placing their money in what they see as sustainable forms of investment over the years ahead. That's why it's absolutely right that to give an incentive to pension funds and others for the long-term investment, we need a decarbonisation target. We need other measures to improve the confidence.
Maybe answer on that one.
Oh no, you've got to give them confidence to invest.
Thank you. Liz Truss, just briefly, would you like them to divest?
No.
No, thank you. Ed Davey?
They must divest from coal. I make a distinction between coal and oil and gas. We've got to get out of coal rapidly, but we're going to need a lot of oil and gas over the next 2 and 3 decades as we decarbonise. Our carbon plan to meet our climate change targets shows us using quite a bit of oil in the transport and heating sector over the next few decades, so it would be completely mad to divest out of those. But what I do think is most exciting in this area, and I congratulate The Guardian for leading on this issue in the media. I might get a plug tomorrow, you never know. But the reason why I think it's really important is if you look at the work that the Bank of England's doing, the Bank of Brazil, the Bank of South Africa, and a number of other people are looking at this, we need to ensure that investors who are making long-term investments in pensions, in insurance, and so on, they need to have real disclosure about the carbon assets of particular companies that they are investing in. When you're, it's a very important point, when you're building up assets to go again long-term liabilities, if in 2 or 3 or 4 decades those carbon assets are not going to be worth anything, then investors need to know that today. So investor disclosure, reporting requirements, really strict, are the ones that we need to push through in the UK and across the world.
Thank you. Just a question I'd just like to ask just before we come to our wrap-up question. Caroline Flint, do the world's population have the right to consume as much as us?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things that is always difficult, and certainly at any negotiations in terms of tackling how we reduce emissions, how do we manage development in a sustainable way, is
to... A simple yes or no would do. Do they have the right to consume?
No, I think they have a right to want some of the things that we take for granted, and some of that includes, for example, the like to run a school, the like to, be able to have, in your evenings at home, to be able to talk with the kids and meet, heat for your fuel and for your cooking. Now, the big task for us is to try and find ways in which we can demonstrate that that can be achieved and that can be provided for in a cleaner and a better way going forward. And that's why, in Paris, it's going to be very important to look at ways in which richer countries can support those poorer countries to meet their needs in the way our needs are met, but in a way that is more sustainable and cleaner going forward. That is the question that has to be answered.
Liz Truss, do you think the world's population have the right to consume at the same level that we do?
Well, I do, and that's why I think that we absolutely, when we're setting things like climate change targets, we need to help those countries. I completely agree. And I think we don't just need to help them in terms of achieving climate change targets, also on issues like air pollution, water pollution. We need to help those countries and share with them the technologies we've developed, as well as developing our own technology.
We have the worst air pollution just down the road in the whole world.
Well,
how can we possibly help them?
Well, I've actually recently...
We have to do less. We have to reduce.
I have recently had a discussion...
3 safe levels just down the road.
Can I answer that question?
Very briefly, please.
Yes, we need to do more on air pollution. We've invested $2 billion over the course of this Parliament, and we have seen levels of particulate matter and nitrous oxides reduce over the course of this Parliament. And likewise, water pollution, we've seen the level of phosphates and sulfides reduce. Of course, we need to do more, but the issues in China are extremely stark. And I discussed with the Minister of Environmental Protection how we can work together on issues like reducing air pollution, as well as achieving climate targets, as well as issues like water pollution and flood protection. These are issues that face a lot of countries. We do have excellent green technology in this country, and I think we can use it to help others.
Thank you. I will let Caroline Lucas answer that question, but I'd just like to repose the starting question first. There's a reason for this, it'll become apparent. So, we've got a little sneak of it there, the early result. So, we'll see if there's any change. Are you optimistic that the next government will make progress on the environment? Now, I'm told that after you press your button, it takes a little time for the technology to deliver a result. So while that's happening, I'd like to ask Caroline Lucas about the world's population having the right to consume as much as us, or what you think of the panel's responses that they do, in effect.
Well, I think the bottom line is that we have a world of finite resources and also a world with a rising population. And if everybody aspired to the same production and consumption patterns that we currently have in the rich West, then we would need 3 planets in order to provide the resources and absorb the wastes. Now, having said that, I think the responsibility is on us to be reducing the environmental impact of our production and consumption patterns.
And actually consuming less?
Ensuring consuming less, in some cases, yes, having better quality, but not necessarily more and more quantity. There is a difference between those two. I think we need to be providing the finance for poorer countries so that they can leapfrog some of the dirtiest development that we've had in the West. But crucially, I think we do need to tackle this whole issue of consumption patterns and a consumerist society, which, in the wonderful words of Tim Jackson, persuade us to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to see if there has been any change in the room's feeling about... Strikes me you've got a little bit of work to do in the next 4 or 5 weeks, ladies and gentlemen, in order to convince the room that you are going to, and the wider society, perhaps more importantly, that you are going to deliver on the environment. I know it's time to end, but I just... Ed, as I didn't ask you the last question, what do you feel about that result? Do you feel a bit guilty? Do you feel responsible for the fact that... I mean, I'll speak on behalf of all politicians here.
No. The head boy.
Well, I mean, you know, people are not impressed by what they're hearing from the politicians when it comes to optimism about the environment.
That is worrying. And we've got to try to get over, build that trust and show that we have got serious policies. I mean, I can reiterate the Liberal Democrats' 5 green rules.
That's okay, we got those.
If you like, because I think they would make a huge difference. But I think we've got to work internationally. That's the other thing, the dimension that I want to keep re-emphasising. And let me go back to your question about do other people around the world have a right to consume as much as we do? I do believe they do, because I do think there's something called green growth. And green growth, if you promote resource efficiency, in the way that actually Caroline was talking about, and agree we can really use our resources far more efficiently, but also low carbon growth. In India, there's 300 million Indians without access to electricity. 300 million. They mainly live in rural areas. They're never going to get the type of energy systems we've had in the past to them. But they do have, I think, a right to be able to enjoy some of the advantages that electricity brings. But guess what? Solar power is going to deliver that to them. Solar power, which we've not really talked about at all tonight, just touched on it, is one of the biggest steps forward for humanity we've seen in the last five years or more. The declining cost of it is fantastic, and it's going to mean we're going to be able to bring electricity with all the advantages that is on for education and health and economic progress to people in the poorest parts of our world. And I think the fact that that has been developing primarily through the German subsidies, but we've played our role too, and through the research and development that goes on, is one of the things where I'm actually more optimistic about the environment, and hopefully we can take another vote.
OK. Thank you very much indeed to the panel. And just as a closing thought, I would love to encourage the politicians to have ambition when it comes to environmental goals and ambition to convince other members of their party that they are important and they are vote winners and they should get them out there. But just with that thought, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to the panel and thank you for coming.